You've been doing a lot of amazing research on the Naassenes, one of the many Christianities that are around in the 2nd into the 3rd centuries. You have a lot of great videos on Patreon, and you actually have a book coming out. The book is called The Naassenes, Exploring an Early Christian Identity. You can pre-order this. You can go on Dr. Lego's Patreon, and I'm sure he'll have deals for you to sign. I feel it's important to come back to a basic text of your research, which is Found Christianities. So in this text, you propose kind of more like a laboratory model of 2nd century Christianities. I feel this is very important for understanding the Naassenes. So I didn't know if you could briefly just discuss that.
So the laboratory model is one model that scholars have understood the 2nd century. Basically, it's the Wild West of Christianity. There's no such thing as orthodoxy. And so in the book, I don't refer to orthodoxy or Gnostic. I don't use those categories of orthodoxy and heresy with which to kind of divvy up the material because they didn't exist. Obviously, there were people who thought they were right, but everyone who thinks that they're right. I mean, and when you're at the time of the 2nd century, everyone is experimenting because no one is telling them or controlling them. There's no church hierarchy. That's decades, if not centuries away. There's no oversight. There's no committee on faith and, practice. There's no one watching over you. They're just daring, more philosophically minded theologians who are essentially producing great works of meditation, of spirituality, of literature, and are performing rituals, inventing, tweaking, and going to town, basically, with things that, have been picked up in modern times, that, these kinds of rituals, these thoughts, like people don't know that transmigration was once a Christian doctrine. People don't know that, in the annals of Western spirituality, the Christians were some of the most creative and bright lights that we have ever seen. In all these traditions that we think of as Eastern or that we might associate with, say, Hinduism or, say, Buddhism, some of those elements also appear in these early stages of Christianity as it was in its infancy. It's a laboratory of experimentation. It's also a rainforest in the sense that everybody is just trying to reach the sunlight, and there's no control on the growth, and there's no control on who is most successful or not. There's just a wonderful plethora and proliferation of ideas.
That's a great point. Just one thing I would like to add to that is probably when we read these texts in hindsight, we look at them from maybe a perspective of pure social cohesion that perhaps isn't there. When they talk about things like communities, sometimes it's trying to, as you say in the book, convey a sense of social cohesion that's an ideal as opposed to reality. When people are creating these spaces and saying this person's an outsider, a heretic, a Gnostic, or whatever, versus the Orthodox, many times it's an ideal versus a reality.
People do this today. I mean, obviously there are group identities in the ancient world, but it's more true, I think, to say that people are wanting to create those identities, and bold and imaginative and creative writers are wanting to portray themselves as centers of a community, and they may or may not be. We don't know how cohesive they were, but there does seem to be, in the case of the Naassenes, a kind of minimal group identity, which we can talk about later.
We were just talking about creating the kind of concept of the insider and the outsider. This really ties into the evidence that we do have for the Naassenes. I don't know if you could just kind of go over what evidence we have that even tells us about these figures.
Well, we have two sources for the Naassenes, both of them polemical. The main source is the Refutation of All Heresies, and you'll get that on my Patreon. I've got it in PDF form. That is I believe it's like 900 some pages. It's the text that is so much better than Irenaeus, but for some reason people only kind of focus on Irenaeus. But the Refutation of All Heresies is written by an anonymous person who's in competition with the Bishop of Rome in the early 2nd century. And his contribution is to give reports of his opponents that go beyond Irenaeus and that also are more, shall we say, more faithful to the reports themselves, more faithful to the data or the documents that this author had. He's a paraphraser. He's not writing word for word, but the documents that he gets, and one of them being the Nicene sermon or discourse, he more or less faithfully reports back in a way that is not utterly going to destroy the structure of the discourse. One of the things that I do in the book, the Naassenes, is to reconstruct the original Nicene discourse based on what we know of what the refutator does and how he works. The refutator gives us access to an actual sermon, if you will, or discourse from a Gnostic preacher. And that's fantastic. That's something so much more rich and in depth than the kind of staccato, abbreviated reports that Irenaeus gives.
So the refutator, as you call him, or some scholars would call it Pseudo-Hippolytus, wrote the refutations of all heresies in the mid-2nd century. So as far as the Naassenes are concerned, we're looking at a time period of roughly late 2nd, early 3rd, correct?
The refutation is probably finished at about the death of Callistus of Rome, which is 222. And yes, it probably, since Irenaeus doesn't mention the Naassenes, probably he didn't know of them, which indicates that knowledge of the Naassenes came to Rome sometime after 180. So between 180 and 220, they are known in Rome. Now, they could have been earlier. Since I put them in Alexandria, the Naassenes could have been, mid-2nd century, certainly prior to 222. And I don't call him Pseudo-Hippolytus, just because he never calls himself Hippolytus. And it's fine. I mean, it's fine if people want to call him Hippolytus or Pseudo-Hippolytus. I'm not a curmudgeon or cantankerous about it. But it's important for everybody to recognize that Hippolytus is a name that is only attributed to this author in the 19th century based on fairly shoddy reconstructions of some shadowy figure of Hippolytus of Portus, who died in 235 as a martyr. His profile doesn't really fit the refutator's profile, who basically considers himself the Bishop of Rome. That's a side note.
Yeah, and if you want to learn more about that, of course, there's the introduction to Refutation of All Heresies available on Dr. Whitwell's Patreon. Just roughly, who was the Nicene preacher?
It's hard to say. I give my profile at the end of the book after I've done all the hard work of reconstructing what the original discourse looked like, what the rituals look like, what the hymns look like, what the theology looked like. But basically, to sum it up, I put the Nicene preacher in Alexandria. He's a cosmopolitan Alexandrian multicultural figure who believes that he can meld Christianity or see Christianity in virtually all Greco-Roman cults. Much like other Christians were reading the Old Testament as a testament to Christ, the Nicene preacher was reading Greek religions as a testament to Christ. And he doesn't seem to be too familiar or too interested in Roman religion. But he's highly interested in mystery religions, and he takes them as signs and symbols of a true Christianity. He sees the original religion of humankind as a form of Christianity that was degraded and changed over time. But there are still signs and symbols of the reality of Christ all over the Greco-Roman world in Greco-Roman temples. Although the worshipers have forgotten the original meanings of the words, they are still there. And so the most famous example is that this author says that the Hermes, which are statues of Hermes, they're usually in square columns, with the bearded head of Hermes on top and an erect phallus or penis sort of in the middle, that he takes the phallus itself as a symbol of the spiritual power of the mind and of Christ himself. The snake is also a phallic symbol, and he takes it in the same way. And so he's reading snake imagery in temples, and he's also just looking at temples themselves and saying that things like the word for temple in Greek is naos, and the transliterated word for snake in Greek, taken from Hebrew, is naas. And so his argument is that, well, originally people referred to all sacred spaces as snake spaces. Since the snake is a symbol of Christ, there you go. All temples are in origin temples of Christ. It's a far out argument. I mean, it stretches belief and imagination, but this is how this guy operates. He loves etymology. He's very educated. He's either been initiated into other mystery cults or he has read about them. I mean, he must have had an incredible library, which is, again, one of the reasons why I want to put him in Alexandria, because he knows so much and he doesn't mind telling you about all that he knows about Cybele, about the Samothracian gods, the great gods of Samothrace, the Eleusinian deities, Demeter, and her daughter, Cori, and he's got it all. I mean, it's such a fireworks display of knowledge. It fits perfectly into the second sophistic as a kind of didactic speech, that what I like to call a speech of showing off, just showing off your vast knowledge.
The rhetorical declamatory kind of style that, yeah, you could totally see that, can't you, in his work?
Absolutely. And it's off the cuff. A lot of it is very spontaneous. One wonders, I mean, of course it was written down, but one wonders, is he doing this, extemporaneously? Because some of the stuff is very, very wacky. But I mean, it's very well thought out, but it's just so far out, and it's so different than what other Christians are saying, because you have other Christians who are basically kind of like circling the wagons at this time, like, oh, don't mess with Greco-Roman religions. They are, the temples are the houses of demons. Other gods are really demons. And so we kind of circle the wagons and isolate ourselves. I mean, we can deal with Greco-Roman philosophy, but don't do anything with Greco-Roman religion. The Naassenes preacher is like, bring it on. All of Greco-Roman religion, that is Christianity to me. This is like why this guy is so brilliant, why his kind of wild genius is still so amazing and offensive today, because he really is the first thinker ever to think in terms of Christianity as a world religion, as manifest in all other forms of religion.
What is the importance of placing the preacher and the Naassenes in Alexandria? We have our most famous friends from Alexandria, Clement, Origen, and of course Philo, right? All these brilliant people. It just seemed to be like the Wax Trax Records, if anybody's an industrial fan out there of the record label of the day, like just all these brilliant figures and thoughts. I didn't know if you could just talk about Alexandria, why, just as a port city, you were mentioning cosmopolitanism. And Alexandria is a marketplace of ideas. So I didn't know if you could just kind of touch upon that a little bit more.
Alexandria, it's a university town. It boasts the number one university of its time. It's sort of like Harvard, but it's got so many other things to say for it. It's sort of like Harvard plus Los Angeles, maybe plus Las Vegas. It's kind of like got it all. It's known as an extremely like multicultural area, where you would get obviously native Egyptians, Ethiopians, traders from India are documented there. I mean, Clement of Alexandria is really the first person of antiquity who mentions Buddha. He knows about Buddha. I mean, no one else seems to know about Buddha, but Clement mentions Buddha. So they know about that stuff, and obviously they've got the Roman influence, and it's an old Macedonian settlement, so the main language is Greek. It's an amazing confluence of discourses and ideas. You mentioned great Alexandrian thinkers, but for me, the real greats are people like Valentinus and Basilides and Carpocrates. These are the theologians of Christianity before anyone else gets their act started. You think of in the Orthodox tradition, where you've got people reaching back to Justin Martyr, reaching back to Irenaeus, reaching back to Theophilus of Antioch. All these guys are late second century or mid to late second century, whereas this explosion of genius occurs in Alexandria during the Hadrianic period, which is between 117 and 138. It's the earliest flowering of Christian theology ever, and that's a fact. Now, if people want to say, Paul is the first theologian, that's wonderful. But when you're thinking of actual Christian metaphysics, that is, of thought about the superior world, of the real confluence, the disciplined academic thought between Christianity and the classical world, between Christianity and Platonism, Christianity and Stoicism, all of this occurs first in Alexandria. Alexandria continues to be this immensely important voice for the antiquity. So one of the ways that I conceive of, or try to reconceive of the debate between orthodoxy and heresy is it's not about orthodoxy and heresy. It's about a theology that is rejected and a theology that is accepted. It's about Rome versus Alexandria. It's about Rome's reaction to Alexandria. Because remember, Irenaeus mostly identifies with Rome. And when Alexandrian ideas begin to seep into the Roman sphere, as it were, beginning with Valentinus in the 140s or 130s and 140s, there is a kind of reaction in the 150s and 160s from the likes of Justin Martyr, and then eventually the big reaction by Irenaeus in 180, and then by the Refutator. All of these essentially Rome-based thinkers are responding to Alexandrian-based thinkers, people like Valentinus, people like Basilides, people like Carpocrates. And remember that even Simon of Samaria was said to have a stint in Egypt. So what this really is about when you're looking at the cultural trends, it's really not about vague and abstract orthodoxy and heresy. It's about a debate between competing cities. And those cities are Rome and Alexandria, which, since the days of Caesar Augustus, were always viewed as in competition. There was always a culture war between Rome and Alexandria. Rome was like the discipline, the hierarchy, the masculine. Alexandria was this explosion of luxury and pleasure, Eastern thought, metaphysics. It's really where Platonism explodes outward, and from Alexandria, it kind of takes in everything else. The great thinkers, like Plotinus, they start out in Alexandria. This is really something very important. I don't say it's a fact that the Naassenes preacher came from Alexandria. I have 6 arguments that I take you through in my introduction that go point by point through the Naassenes discourse to try to argue that he's Alexandrian. In the end, you'll have to read it for yourself and tell me what you think, because I'm interested. I've also got a book on Alexandria coming out as well. That'll come out in early 2024, so stay tuned.
Since we're in Alexandria, just think about the Naassenes preacher, and his tendency towards the verbose, towards the obvious traits of a second sophistic paideia. Part of the paideia is that you have this middle Platonic and Stoic kind of way of allegorical reading at this time. I was talking to Boy Stones about the allegorical method. Of course, we have Stoic allegorical readers like Posidonius, Chaeremon, Cornutus. We talked about him. Jewish allegorical thinkers, Philo from Alexandria. This kind of stemmed out of a system that kind of sprang up almost as soon as like archaic Greek literature sprang up. George said that it seems even as soon as Homer and Hesiod appeared, they were causing problems for people. And people had to kind of reconcile these problems. So it kind of grew in from the historical allegorical method into the Neoplatonic and now the Christian method that the Nicene preacher is using. So I don't know if you could just talk about the Middle Platonic and allegorical reading style, the allegorical method and the etymological style. Just why is it important for understanding the preacher's thought process?
The best person to compare with the Nicene preacher is Cornutus. Cornutus is really key for comparison because he is going to use etymologies to help you understand the original meaning of, say, a Greek word or a god's name or something like that. He'll tell you what Athena really means by looking at other similar sounding words. And the assumption is that way back in the day in antiquity, the inventors of the original language actually were sages of old. And so they built into their language signs and symbols of the truth which they, as the primitive sages, had original access to. Really, when you look at the preacher's mode of allegory, it's probably better described as simply etymological exegesis. He's looking at words like Adam. He's thinking, Adam, what's Adam? Well, it's Adamos. It's the Greek word for steel or diamond. So Adamos is the man of steel. When he's thinking of Naas, or the temple, he etymologizes it so that it goes back to a Hebrew word for snake. Again, he's etymologizing and he's etymologizing, titles for Jesus himself, and he's etymologizing things in the New Testament. And really, anything is fair game for him in the Greco-Roman world, and he uses etymology as his kind of like way to explain everything. It's his way to fit together his theory of everything. From our perspective, this is the part that seems really far-fetched to us. That's why I really emphasize that reading the Nicene sermon in English, I do the best that I can, but in the end, all the etymologies are Greek-based. This is the problem. He's like producing this like genius set of similar sounding words, but that's very hard to convey over English. So, if you're retired or if you have some time on your hands, learn Greek. I can help you learn that on the Patreon. But obviously, if you don't have time, read my translation. I do the best that I can, but it's all there in the Greek, and I try to explain it to you through transliteration as much as I can. And it's fun. I mean, in the end, it's something enjoyable. I think that people will kind of chuckle to themselves a little bit at how creative, I call it a wild genius, because it's, you see this guy like making fun with words. Sometimes you're like, how far is this guy going to go? But in the end, it's just, I think it's just raw genius and experimentation. It's what gives this thinker just an amazingly different vibe than any other kind of reading of a Christian theologian where, they would be laying out the doctrine. It's much more experiential and vibrant. It's sort of like being constantly overwhelmed by the kind of concatenation of images and associative readings. And he's constantly switching back from the Septuagint to Homer he mentions figures like, Anacreon, who's this great lascivious Greek poet. And he's kind of obscure and he's throwing in bits of Heraclitus. I mean, it's all coming at you like at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And so read the footnotes. It's all there. This guy's amazing.
It really is a wild ride when you read these Stoic and later Middle Platonic and the Neoplatonic allegorical readers. Like I'm thinking something like Porphyry's Cave of the Nymphs, just like these wild theoretical kind of frameworks for like, okay, well, this sounds like this in Greek. We're talking about the etymological aspect of it. You do mention in your excellent video series on the Naassenes on your Patreon, there is one aspect about the way the Greek of the Septuagint, there were no accent marks. I thought I'd pull up this section from the Septuagint version of Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, kai epen hotheos genetheto phos.
If you're reading a Greek text, genetheto phos, this is not something that the Naassenes preacher brings out, but it is something that Sethian Christians and Ophite Christians just assume is what's going on. Phos, as a Greek word, depending on its accent, if it has a circumflex accent, it means light. If it has an acute accent, it means man or hero. So they were reading it both ways. So genetheto phos would mean let there be a man, and there was a man. And they viewed this man as the original light man, the model of the earthly human. So you've got Genesis 1:3, the creation of the light man. And then that makes sense of Genesis 1:26, because then God says, let's make a man in our image and likeness. And he's already got the light man. Basically, the earthly man is then made in the image of the light man. And the person whom God or Yahweh or whatever is speaking to is the light man, whom he's already made in Genesis 1:3.
That reminds me actually of how Philo interprets Genesis. I think the common source probably, this is just my speculation, just from their Paideia, a fantastic Philonic scholar, David Runia, in his book Plato's Timaeus and Philo of Alexandria, mentioned that Timaeus, more than any other text, maybe perhaps the Iliad, was the text for an educated person during this period of time. So I know Philo is doing something similar with his interpretation of Genesis that perhaps the Naassenes preacher is doing here.
Not many people read that really thick and intimidating book, Philo of Alexandria and the Timaeus of Plato, but it's an unsurpassed work of scholarship.
Obviously, we can't say he's there in Alexandria for sure, but you make a strong argument, like you say in your book, that perhaps he was. And if we're placing him there, just from what we know about the cosmopolitan aspect of Alexandria, about the kind of paideia that was there, what does this really say about like the cosmology? Let's just get into the cosmology itself of the Naassenes and their ritual practices.
There's often a confusion among people that, including among scholars, that they don't distinguish Naassenes from Ophites, because Ophis is the Greek word for snake, and Naas is also this transliterated Hebrew word for snake. And so the temptation is to say, oh, well, this must be the same group. But they have very different ideas, very different cosmologies. But there is one overlapping idea for the Naassenes and the Ophites. Ultimate reality is human. The true God is a human being with a capital H, and that God's immediate offspring is a child of the human. If you're reading Irenaeus, book 1, chapter 30, he tells you that he doesn't call them Ophites, but this is what they came to be called, that they have a system of 3 humans and 1 female entity. The Naassenes are rigorous binitarians, which is to say that they have 2 essential beings in the Godhead. One is the human, the other is the child of the human. And the human is the unformed, ultimate, infinite reality. And the child of the human is the logos, the rational form, the rational pole of the Godhead. And it's the child of the human that has got fragmented and stuck in human souls. And so salvation is the redemption and bringing together, gathering together of the child of the human within all of us. There's obviously much more to it. They experiment with the gender of the first human. They experiment with all sorts of ideas about, consubstantiality, and about how our souls are consubstantial with the Son of the human, just to give the basic rough and ready sense of the theology. That's it. It's a classic 2nd century binitarian theology. Some people are under the impression, I think quite mistakenly, but scholars are in part to blame for this, is that the Naassenes don't seem sufficiently Christian, which is odd because they refer to Jesus, the blessed, and the famous hymn, the Naassenes hymn, is all about Jesus. So, I mean, if these people aren't Christians, I don't, it's like, let's just call a spade here. This is about Jesus. Jesus is that child of the human. But the child of the human is obviously much bigger than Jesus, and the child of the human is in some special way manifest in Jesus. But the child of the human is manifest in all of us. And he's manifest in all religions. And this is the key distinctive of the Naassenes preacher. In terms of ritual, just quickly, the Naassenes preacher will, like many other second century Christians, take the basic rituals of the Christian community, which is a water rite and a table rite, and he will make modifications. One of the very distinctive Naassenes modifications is he's very firm on anointing. He talks about oil and the use of oil, and oil shows up as an anointing practice. And we don't know exactly how that worked out, but it is true that for many second century Christians in Syria and in Egypt, oil and anointing was extremely important. And it's why Christians were called Christians, because to be anointed is to be a Christos. And it's not just the Messiah who's anointed, it's everybody else. So there you have it. Those rituals, what we might refer to as Eucharist, anointing, and baptism, are the kind of staples that we see elsewhere. We also see them singing hymns. We see them obviously giving sermons and discourses. It seems to appeal to a very intellectual sort of group in Alexandria, but also a group that is wanting to kind of integrate Greco-Roman religions with the new faith in Christ.
Aside from the wacky kind of etymology and the concept of the Adamas, the human and the son of the human, really the ritual practices that they're doing, especially the ascetic aspect of it, right, would be almost indistinguishable from a figure like, I'm thinking like a Julius Cassianus. They're very ascetic. So maybe they wouldn't be that different in terms of like the actual day-to-day ritual ascetic practices that they're doing.
Yeah, they're a group that is very high on what might be called spiritual sex, but very low on what they would view as sex between mortal bodies. And that's definitely in line with Julius Cassianus. It's definitely in line with Marcion and Tatian. Definitely those are figures to compare. They aren't Encratites. They don't seem to have any problem with meat or wine, but for them, it is a kind of spiritualized sexual encounter that they are trying to push. It's an intellectual kind of intercourse that they're after. Literally, they see salvation as the separation of your mind, and then coming into consubstantial union with other minds, because our minds are already on some level consubstantial with the child of the human, and the reintegration of the child of the human. That's the point of creation. So yes, they do appear ascetic. Absolutely. It's important to understand why. And especially for the Naassenes, because even in modern scholarship, they've been accused of all sorts of weird rites where they are very centered on the symbol of the phallus, which has gotten people's imagination to run wild and to think that, oh, okay, so they were using the phallus in worship, or they used snakes in worship, or they were, essentially, basically having sex in worship. I mean, you see the whole kind of gamut. People want to see the Naassenes as supporting some kind of sexual rite based on the image of the phallus. But when you read what they're talking about, the Refutator makes absolutely clear that they were all celibate, which is something that annoys him greatly, because to be celibate in the ancient world is to be pure. And among the Refutator's early Catholic community, he can't convince people to be pure. They're just not rigorous enough. So it deeply annoys him that his enemies end up more pure and more celibate than his community. So the fact that he's calling them celibate and calling them, Galli, which are the priests of Cybele who are all emasculated and therefore unable to have, physical intercourse, that greatly annoys him. And so that's important context to keep in mind.
I wanted to kind of circle back around to this because I feel it's kind of important because, like you said, with the sources that we have, especially on the Naassenes, the sources we have are from hostile heresiological reports. So one of the main points of a heresiological report, and what they try to kind of do is they kind of write them in a style as like you would find like in a Diogenes Laertius, like Lives of the Sophists. They're doing the kind of same thing with like these philosophical schools of thought by setting up these heresies, for lack of a better word, or Gnostic groups as almost like pagan philosophical schools. When we're reading somebody like Pseudo-Hippolytus or the Refutator, like you point out in your research and in the videos, we tend to see the Naassenes as primarily almost completely influenced by Hellenistic theology, and certainly this was something that a scholar in the late 19th, early 20th century, like Wittgenstein, would trap into. So did the Nicene preacher and the Naassenes disregard the Bible? Like you were saying, they draw upon a lot of different sources besides just Hellenic theology.
Wittgenstein is a great example of a scholar who did a tremendous good and tremendous harm. The good that he did was he was the first to realize that the Nicene sermon is built out of an original hymn to Attis, that is the god, the lover of Cybele. And it's basically like a commentary on this hymn to Attis, which appears at the end of the discourse. And so this is absolutely key insight, genius. This couldn't be more clear that the Nicene preacher views Attis as a manifestation of Jesus. And Attis, according to worshippers of Attis, was a symbol of all other gods and rites. And so the Nicene preacher is essentially taking this idea and running with it and just basically adding one more layer and saying, okay, yes, Attis is that, but Jesus is Attis. So there you go. And he's then going back and forth between these mystery cults and the Septuagint and the New Testament. The way that Wittgenstein set us back was that he thought that a Christian couldn't have written the Nicene sermon because it engages so much with these Greco-Roman religions, because it engages so much with these mystery cults. Wittgenstein just couldn't bring himself to believe that a Christian would actually believe that Attis and Christ were the same being. And of course, there are many Christians today who would, consider that utter anathema and blasphemy. But this is exactly what the Nicene preacher says, and he's always talking about Jesus. So what Wittgenstein had to do was he basically had to cut out all the New Testament and Old Testament citations, of which there are over 100 built into the text. And so he took scissors and cut all those out, and then he reconstructed the sermon. And then 25 years later, he said, actually, it's only the New Testament stuff that must be added later. So he added back into it all of these Septuagints. And you can see, like, he flip-flopped, and he realized that his method was just was not very good, obviously, because the method that says, I can't believe you're a Christian, therefore I'm going to cut out all the Christian elements. I mean, it's sort of like very willful, and no credible scholar would do that today. But there's still this impulse to see, the Naassenes as fundamentally non-Christian, and that the Christianity is kind of like the icing on the cake, sort of something superficial. And that's certainly how the Refutator would want you to see that. And that's what's really important here, that by taking that view, you essentially take and slightly tweak the views of the heresiologists themselves, which is highly problematic, because the heresiologists are trying to convince you, oh, hey, these people are pagan, evil, bad, 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 bad. Look, they're talking about mystery cults, bad, 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 bad. And so with that kind of rhetoric, scholars, obviously not in such a simplistic form, but in a more sophisticated way, say, these people, they can't be Christian. They must have become Christian at some other point, or maybe a later editor came in and made them Christian.
The preacher is not just using the pagan paideia. He's not just using people like Homer, Empedocles, Parmenides, right? He's also using a lot of Hebrew Bible, which again throws a wrench in this whole concept of Gnostics, not believers in those texts. He's also using things like Thomas, right? It's Alexandria who's not using Thomas at this time. But he's also using standard run-of-the-mill, what we would consider today canonical texts. He's using John extensively, right? He's using Paul.
For those who are interested in the Gospel of Thomas, the Nicene preacher is one of the earliest users of the Gospel of Thomas. And that's really important because we really don't have a lot of other people quoting the Gospel of Thomas. And so I've got a long section on that. It seems like the Nicene preacher did have a four-gospel canon, as it were. I use that term loosely. But basically, he ignored Mark. And for him, the four Gospels were Thomas, John, Matthew, and Luke. Maybe not so much Luke, but those were the four. And so that's important to note that in Alexandria, if he was in Alexandria, Thomas is just as important in the late 2nd century as any of the others. And it's really Mark who, scholars have known this for years, is basically ignored by a lot of early Christians because they see it as a kind of abbreviated Matthew, and therefore they're like, well, why use the abbreviation? So this is the canon of the preacher, and yes, he's constantly quoting the Gospels, and he's not only quoting the Gospels, he's constantly seems to be quoting from memory because he's conflating, that is, melding together passages so that when he reports them, evidently orally, he basically combines things that were never combined in the scriptures themselves, but we can kind of trace where he got them from. And, one of the key examples here is the Nicene preacher is constantly referring to the third gate. Jesus is the third gate. And he's conflating in his head the idea that Paul went to the third heaven, which is in 2 Corinthians 12, and that Jesus is the gate, which is in John 10. And since he's conflated that in his head, he's constantly saying, go through the third gate. Whereas the third gate, there is no third gate in the New Testament, but in his head there is, because he's conflated two passages from the New Testament. And so you can tell how closely he knows it. And he's basically just citing it from memory. He doesn't have a text in front of him. He's just spinning it out from memory. In the 50s and 60s, whenever you mentioned Thomas, you also had to mention Naassenes, who were the earliest users of Thomas. The sad fact of modern scholarship is you have scholars who are like scholars only in the Gospel of Thomas, but they know nothing of the Naassenes. And that, I think, is sad, because if we don't know who's first using the material, and the Naassenes are using it at least 100 years before the Manichaeans are, and we don't see how they're using it, well, then we're not really helping ourselves. But it's clear that the Naassenes are using it as scripture. It is just as important, if not more important, than any other gospel text. And in terms of the manuscript attestation, in the 2nd and 3rd century, Thomas is just as well attested as any other gospel in Egypt.
I wanted to touch upon perhaps the most famous example, this amazing synthesis of the Nicene hymn, comparing Jesus to Attis.
I've got a video on this on, I think now both my Patreon and the YouTube channel. Basically, the Nicene preacher said that he was at a theater and he heard this hymn to Attis that was spoken. And it just dawned on him that all of the things spoken of Attis applied equally to Jesus. So he goes through systematically, and he's like, I can make connections between the story of Attis and the story of Jesus. And you're like, well, how exactly do you do that? And because it's not easy to compare to a crucified Jewish peasant to a Phrygian demigod who cuts off his own penis. I mean, this is quite striking, but this is what he does. And the importance of the Attis hymn, it's not just about Attis, it's about other gods who are melded with Attis. So by commenting line by line on the Attis hymn, he can hit all the major gods and goddesses, including Cybele and including Samothracian deities, Osiris and Isis, and he's very interested in these Eastern deities. He doesn't hit Mithras, and he doesn't hit any Roman deities, but he's very much interested in these Eastern deities, and it's not like he's not a Phrygian. He doesn't come up with an idea of dying and rising, but he does definitely think that, just on one level of comparison, that Attis is resurrected, and that he thinks that the resurrection of Attis and the resurrection of Christ describe the same event. And then even the emasculinization of Attis, the cutting off the penis, represents the removal of our mind, our essential selves, which is a bit of Christ, and cutting that off from the body and the lower soul so that it can be brought up into spiritual fellowship with Cybele, but Cybele being more of a symbol of the higher world. And this is his kind of thought.
Good luck with the book. The book is, again, called The Naassenes, Exploring an Early Christian Identity. Like I said, it's on pre-order. You can get it on Amazon. I believe it's published by Routledge, correct?
Yeah, it's a Routledge book. I'll be getting copies myself, and for patrons, I can sign them and send it to you. If you want a signed copy, I can get that to you. Just hop on Patreon. The book should be out by Halloween. Mid-October is what I've heard.